The first thing no one in that room expected was the silence. Not the silence of prayer. Not the silence that settles after a blessing. It was the silence that comes when people understand, all at once, that something sacred has been neglected for too long. Pope Leo XIV stood beside a narrow bed inside Casa Sant'Angelo, his white cassock creased from hours of walking through cold corridors that should never have been cold. He had entered without cameras, without warning, without the smooth machinery of Vatican ceremony around him. Now he stood before an elderly priest who had once crossed oceans for the church, and the Pope could no longer keep his face still. The man in the bed was 91 years old. He had spent 30 years as a missionary in Congo. He had given his youth, his strength, his body, his memory, and almost everything the world could take from a man. When he opened his eyes and saw the white figure standing above him, he did not recognize the Pope. He asked a smaller question. He asked if Leo was the doctor. That was the moment the room changed. Father Andres Valdivia saw the Pope's jaw tighten. Elena, the young nurse, stopped moving. The cold hallway outside seemed to hold its breath. The church had honored men like this in documents, speeches, anniversaries, and official photographs. But here, in the room where the heater had failed and dinner had been left untouched beside the bed, honor had arrived too late. Leo did not answer with a command. He did not summon an official. He placed his hand lightly on the old priest's arm and looked at him as if the entire institution had been reduced to one forgotten face. Hours later, when he spoke about what he had seen, his voice broke. Not because he wanted the world to see him suffer, because he had seen what the reports had hidden. A warm chapel beside a freezing corridor. A balanced budget beside an uneaten tray. A lifetime of service beside a room no one had made warm. Before morning, his words would be carried in headlines across 20 countries. Millions would watch the 16 minutes that followed. Some would focus on the tears. Some would call it the most human moment of his young pontificate. But the real story began earlier, before the cameras, before the statement, before the Vatican knew what had happened. It began with one handwritten letter from an 84-year-old nun who feared she would die before anyone powerful enough heard the truth. On the first day of March, 2026, the Vatican was already moving under a familiar pressure. It was the kind of pressure Rome knows how to hide. Doors opened quietly. Offices worked behind polished walls. Men spoke carefully because Pope Leo XIV had been on the chair of Peter for less than 10 months, and already the old rhythm of the institution had changed. The world had first seen him on the afternoon of May 8, 2025, when white smoke rose above the Sistine Chapel and the name Robert Francis Prevost moved across the globe. He was 69 years old, an Augustinian friar from Chicago, the first American pope in the history of the Church. But Rome was not the place that had formed him most deeply. For years he had lived in northern Peru, where ministry was measured less by ceremony than by hunger, heat, dust, and the daily weight of people who had very little left except faith. That history mattered. It explained why his first months had not been quiet. He had reorganized 2 major Vatican dicasteries. He had dismissed a Monsignor whose financial irregularities had been tolerated for nearly a decade. He had issued a directive that no Vatican office should spend more on interior renovations in a single year than it distributed in charitable aid. Inside the old machinery, men understood the message immediately. This pope was not asking the institution to look generous. He was asking it to become accountable. The old guard bristled. The press watched closely. The faithful at the edges of the church watched differently. The poor, the sick, the immigrants, the forgotten. They did not celebrate too quickly. They had seen promises before, but under Leo, something cautious had begun to move among them, the possibility that the Vatican might finally look past its own paperwork and see the people waiting behind it. But none of those reforms prepared anyone for the morning of March 1st. There was no announcement, no press release, No official visit placed on the schedule. Only Father Andres Valdivia, the Pope's personal secretary, knew what was happening. Before sunrise, Pope Leo XIV asked for a car. He gave the destination, and in the silence before Rome fully woke, the Vatican's most powerful man prepared to visit a place that every report said was functioning correctly. The destination was Casa Sant'Angelo, a residential care facility for elderly clergy under Vatican authority, located on a narrow road outside the Leonine walls, about 20 minutes from St. Peter's Square. On paper, it was exactly the kind of institution the Church could point to with confidence. It housed retired priests, aging nuns, and a small number of elderly lay members who had spent their lives in Vatican service. It had operated for decades. It received annual funding from the Holy See's administrative budget. Every report that crossed the desk of the dicastery for clergy said the same thing. Casa Sant'Angelo was functioning correctly. 3 weeks earlier, a letter had reached the Pope. It was not an official memo. It was not a complaint filed through canonical channels. It was handwritten in cramped, careful Italian by Sister Josefina, an 84-year-old Franciscan nun who had served the Church for more than 60 years. The last 4 of those years had been spent as a resident inside Casa Sant'Angelo. She had addressed the letter directly to Pope Leo XIV with no certainty that he would ever see it. She had not written to accuse anyone. She had written because she was afraid. In the first line, she explained that if she did not tell the truth now, she feared she would die before someone with the power to act ever heard it. That was what made the letter different. It did not sound like anger. It sounded like a final attempt to be honest before silence became permanent. Father Andres Valdivia found the letter during the 3rd week of February, buried inside a stack of correspondence that had already been sorted by the papal household staff. He read it at midnight. The next morning, he placed it on the Pope's desk without introduction. Leo read it over breakfast. Afterward, he did not speak for a long time. Sister Josefina wrote about cold hallways. She wrote about meals served at 4 in the afternoon that were already lukewarm by the time they reached the residence. She wrote about staff members who were understaffed and undertrained. People who were trying to do their work but had been stretched beyond what any human being could manage with care. She wrote about priests who had given their entire lives to parish ministry and now spent their final years in rooms with broken heating. She wrote about medication that sometimes arrived late and sometimes did not arrive at all. She wrote about waiting, not as a small inconvenience, but as the daily condition of people who had become invisible inside a place built to protect them. Then she wrote about Father Marco, an 88-year-old former missionary who sat each morning in the corridor in his wheelchair, dressed, holding his rosary, ready for a Mass that was celebrated only twice a week because there was no one available to celebrate it more often. He was not asking for attention. He was waiting for the one thing that had ordered his entire life. Near the end of the letter, Sister Josefina wrote the sentence that stopped Leo. They were not asking for luxury. They were asking not to be forgotten, and she feared they had been. Leo read the letter 3 times. On the 3rd reading, he took a pencil and made one small vertical mark beside that final sentence, the old habit of a canon law professor from Trujillo who marked a text before acting on it. He said nothing to the Secretary of State. He said nothing to the prefect of the dicastery for clergy. He said nothing to the communications office. He only told Father Valdivia to arrange a car for 6 o'clock in the morning on the 1st day of March and to make sure the visit appeared on no official schedule. The car arrived in the early gray of morning. Rome in March still carried winter in its stones, and the streets near the Vatican were nearly empty. A few delivery trucks moved through the pale light. A street sweeper passed slowly over the cobblestones. 2 carabinieri recognized the papal vehicle and straightened as it went by. Pope Leo XIV sat in the back seat wearing his white cassock, holding his breviary in his hands. He was not reading it. Father Valdivia sat nearby and watched him from the corner of his eye. He had served Leo long enough to understand the silence. When the Pope asked for a car at 6 o'clock in the morning and gave no further explanation, the correct response was not a question. It was obedience. The vehicle left the familiar streets around St. Peter's and continued toward the narrow road outside the Leonine walls. There was no escort arranged for public view. No advance notice had been sent. No director at Casa Sant'Angelo had been warned. The visit had not been placed on the official schedule, and that was exactly how Leo wanted it. Casa Sant'Angelo came into view as the car turned down the road. It was a long, pale building with iron balconies and tall, shuttered windows, surrounded by a garden that might have looked gentle in summer. But on that first morning of March, the garden looked bare, cold, and slightly abandoned. The building stood there with the quiet confidence of an institution that had always appeared correct on paper. Leo looked at it without speaking. Then the car stopped. The main gate was unlocked, but no one was there to receive them. Father Valdivia pressed the intercom and waited. Nearly 2 minutes passed before the gate finally buzzed open, and even then, no one came outside. Leo entered without announcement. The first thing he noticed was not disorder, it was something quieter. The entrance hall was clean, but cold. The floor tiles were old and carefully scrubbed. Near the door, a plaster statue of Our Lady stood beside a votive candle that had burned down to nothing and had not been replaced. A young woman in a nurse's uniform appeared from a side corridor and stopped when she saw the white cassock. Her face went pale. She looked about 25 years old, and she already looked tired in the way people look tired when the day has begun before their strength has returned. She managed to say, "Holy Father, we were not told." Leo looked at her without reproach and answered, "I know. I would like to walk. You do not need to call anyone." She walked with them anyway. Her name was Elena. She had been working at Casa Sant'Angelo for 14 months. As they moved through the corridor, she told them she was one of 3 nurses covering the morning shift for 63 residents. Leo did not interrupt her. He did not ask for an explanation. He listened and kept walking. The first corridor was the one Sister Josephina had described in her letter. It was long, narrow, and institutional, with pale green walls and fluorescent lighting that drained the warmth from everything it touched. Several doors were open. In one room, an elderly priest sat by the window, dressed but unshaven, staring toward the garden below. In another, a woman in her 90s lay with her eyes closed, and a rosary beside her pillow, her lips moving slightly. In a third room, a priest appeared to be sleeping, though it was past 7 in the morning. On the table beside him sat an untouched dinner tray from the night before, still covered in plastic wrap. Leo stopped at the doorway. He looked at the tray. Then he looked at the priest. Elena made a small, miserable sound and explained that the night staff had been short 2 people because of illness, and that sometimes the dinner trays were not collected. The Pope did not look away from the bed. He asked only one question. "What is his name?" Elena answered quietly. His name was Father Lorenzo. He was 91 years old. He had been a missionary in Congo for 30 years. Leo stepped into the room without ceremony and moved toward the bed. The old priest opened his eyes slowly, blinking against the light, as if the act of waking required effort from a body that had already given most of itself away. For a moment, Father Lorenzo only looked at him. There was no sudden recognition, no dramatic awareness of the white cassock, no clear understanding that the Bishop of Rome was standing beside his bed. Then something in his face changed. It was not the recognition of office. It was simpler than that. Someone was looking at him directly. Someone had stopped. Leo placed his hand lightly on the old priest's arm and greeted him softly. Father Lorenzo answered in a thin, tired voice. Then he asked if Leo was the doctor. The question stayed in the room longer than anyone expected. Leo did not correct him with authority. He did not explain who he was. He only said that he was just visiting. Father Lorenzo accepted the answer with the quiet dignity of a man who had learned not to demand explanations. He said it was good to have visitors. Leo remained beside him for a few more moments, spoke a few words, and made sure water was within reach. Nothing in the room changed outwardly. The tray was still there. The cold was still there. But something had been recorded in the Pope's face. When Leo returned to the corridor, his expression was controlled. His jaw was set. Father Valdivia had seen that look before. It was not anger in its loud form. It was the moment when Leo stopped weighing what he had heard and began deciding what would happen next. They found Sister Josefina on the second floor. She was in the common room, seated at a table with two other elderly nuns, all three with prayer books open in front of them. She was small, with bright, exhausted eyes, white hair pulled back beneath her veil, and hands folded with the patience of someone who had spent a lifetime waiting without making herself the center of the room. When she looked up and saw Pope Leo XIV standing in the doorway, she did not react at once. She stared at him for several seconds, as if deciding whether the moment was real. Then she pressed one hand over her mouth and closed her eyes. Leo walked to the table and sat down across from her. He did not remain standing over her. He took a plain wooden chair and lowered himself to her level. "I received your letter," he said. Sister Josefina opened her eyes. They were full of tears, but she held them back with the discipline of a woman who had learned long ago how to remain composed. "I was not sure it would arrive," she said. Leo answered, "It arrived." She looked at him for a long time before speaking again. She said they were not ungrateful. She wanted him to understand that the priests and sisters in that house had given their lives, and that they were grateful. They were not bitter. Then she paused. "But they are very cold, and very alone." The last word changed the room. Leo absorbed it without interrupting. He asked her to walk with him if she was able. She rose carefully with her cane, slowly but steadily, carrying herself with the pride of someone who intended to keep walking, as long as her body allowed. She showed him the chapel first. It was small, beautiful, and properly maintained, the one place in the building that had not been allowed to decline. Leo noticed the fresh flowers near the altar and said nothing. The corridor below still had a votive candle burned down to nothing. Then she showed him the kitchen. The cook, Beppe, had worked there for 11 years. He explained, with visible guilt, that he was preparing meals for 63 people with a budget that had not been adjusted in 6 years. He also said the heating system in the East Wing had been reported broken in November, and it was now March. Leo turned to Father Valdivia and said, "Write that down." Pope Leo XIV spent 3 hours inside Casa Sant'Angelo that morning. He did not make a speech. He did not ask for photographs. He did not allow the visit to become a ceremony. He moved from room to room, sat beside residents, held their hands, and listened to the lives that had been left inside that building. They told him about Congo, Peru, Argentina, and Korea. They spoke of missions where they had spent their youth, parishes where they had buried the dead and baptized the newborn, and hospital rooms where they had stood at 3 o'clock in the morning because no one else would come. These were not abstract servants of the Church. They were the people who had carried it in places where the institution was not marble but dust, heat, sickness, poverty, and waiting. One 90-year-old Jesuit priest spoke about saying Mass for minors in Bolivia in the 1970s. Leo listened and understood the full weight of the contradiction in front of him. This man had carried the Church on his back for 50 years, and now he could not receive dinner while it was still warm. By the time Leo prepared to leave, Elena was no longer pale. She was crying, not because he had blamed her, but because he had seen what she was trying to carry. Leo thanked her. He thanked Beppe. He thanked the 2 other nurses who had arrived by then, He shook their hands, looked each of them in the eye, and told them that what they were doing there mattered more than they knew, more than they had been told. He said it plainly. It was not consolation. It was fact. By noon, 3 phone calls had been placed from the papal apartment. The first was to Cardinal Eduardo Bertoni, the prefect of the dicastery for clergy, a careful Roman official who had spent 30 years navigating the Vatican bureaucracy. He answered with the mild weariness of a man who recognized when a calm morning was no longer calm. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. Pope Leo XIV did not raise his voice. He told Bertoni that he had visited Casa Sant'Angelo that morning. He told him the heating in the East Wing had been broken since November. He told him there were 3 nurses for 63 residents. He told him a former missionary to Congo had slept beside an uneaten dinner tray. Then Leo gave the instructions. He expected a full operational and financial audit of Casa Sant'Angelo within 30 days. He expected emergency measures immediately, additional staff, heating repaired within the week. The per-meal budget revised at once. When Bertoni began to say that these matters were ordinarily processed through the usual offices, Leo interrupted him without anger. I am not asking how they are ordinarily processed. I am telling you what will happen. There was a pause. Then Bertoni answered, Of course, Holy Father. The second call went to the Vatican Administrative Office. This time the subject was not only Casa Sant'Angelo, but the budget allocation for church-run elderly care facilities across Rome, including 7 others in the surrounding region. Leo asked for the figures from the last 5 years. He asked for comparisons with what had been spent on dioceses and offices during the same period. He asked that the comparison be presented to him in writing by Friday. He used the word written twice because he wanted the numbers placed where no one could soften them with explanation. The third call was the shortest. It went to his own communications team. Leo told them he wanted to speak publicly about the Church's care for its elderly, not in a prepared address, not in a formal document, a direct statement. He said it would be recorded the following afternoon, and he gave one condition. He did not want it edited for tone. The statement was recorded on the afternoon of March 2nd in a small room beside the library of the Apostolic Palace. There was no podium. There were no flags. There was no arrangement designed to make authority look larger than it already was. Pope Leo XIV sat in a plain chair with a camera in front of him, one operator behind it, and Father Valdivia standing to one side. That was all. He spoke for 16 minutes. It was not the kind of address that could be carried by a transcript alone, because the weight was not only in the words, it was in the pauses. It was in the stillness that entered him when he stopped before saying the next sentence, not because he had forgotten it, but because he knew exactly what it would cost to say it. He began with Leviticus 19:32, the command to rise in the presence of the aged and show respect for the elderly. He said it was not a metaphor. It was not a gentle suggestion. It was a commandment. Then he spoke of the Church across 2,000 years, of hospitals, schools, orphanages, and the great works built in the name of mercy. He did not deny that history. He placed it on the table. Then he said that somewhere inside that long administrative history, the Church had developed a dangerous habit. It had learned to care for institutions while failing to see the people inside them. He said the Church maintained buildings, filed reports, approved budgets, and told itself that caring for the structure meant caring for the person. Then his voice became still. A warm chapel and a broken heater in the room beside it were not the same thing. A balanced ledger and an uneaten dinner tray were not the same thing. He paused long enough for the sentence to settle. Then he said he had visited a home the previous morning, and that he would not name it because naming it would make the failure seem local, when he believed the same failure could be found in other places operated in the name of the Church. He described people who had given their youth, health, years, and strength to God and to the poor. He described them waiting for meals, waiting for warmth, waiting for someone to sit down and ask how they were, not as a duty, but as one human being speaking to another. Then he looked directly into the camera and spoke of the woman who wrote him a letter because she feared the truth would die with her if she remained silent. He spoke of the priest who had spent 30 years in Africa so children he would never see again could be baptized. That priest had been sitting alone in a cold room. He had asked the Pope if he was the doctor. Leo stopped. He looked down for a moment. When he raised his eyes again, they were full. He repeated the question, and this time his voice had changed. It was no longer the voice of a public statement. It was the voice of a man who had seen a failure too clearly to make it safe. He said that Father Lorenzo was 91 years old, that he had given everything, and that the church could not keep his room warm. His hand moved briefly toward his mouth. His shoulders tightened, then released. There was no performance. There was only the weight of what the institution had allowed to become normal. When he continued, his voice was steady again. He said the church did not exist to maintain itself. It existed to love. Real love, the kind that cost something, did not file a report and call it care. Love showed up. Love sat down. Love asked whether someone was sleeping, whether someone was warm, whether someone was afraid. He said the elderly were not burdens to be managed. They were the memory of the church. They had carried the church, and when the church failed to carry them in return, it had failed at the most basic thing it had been asked to do. Then Leo moved from grief to instruction. He asked every diocese, every religious congregation, and every Catholic institution that operated a care facility for elderly people to look that week. Not at the reports, but at the actual places. Walk the corridors. Sit with the residents. Ask the nurses how many people they are covering. Find out when the heating was last repaired. Find out when the last Mass was celebrated. And if the answers made them uncomfortable, he told them to remain uncomfortable long enough for something to change. He spoke for several more minutes about the directives already moving through the relevant dicasteries. An emergency review would be conducted of Vatican-administered care facilities. A working group would be formed, and for the first time it would include representatives from among the elderly residents themselves, people like Sister Josephina, whose direct knowledge of life inside those houses had more value than years of bureaucratic self-assessment. He ended without drama. To every elderly priest, every elderly sister, and every person who had given life to the church and was now living in one of those homes, he said he saw them, not as a category, not as a line in a budget. He saw them, and he asked forgiveness for every moment the church had made them feel invisible. The recording stopped, but the damage to the silence had already been done. By the evening of March 2nd, Pope Leo's statement was moving through newsrooms, Catholic groups, parish phones, and private messages. The Vatican media office had softened 2 lines. Leo removed both edits. He did not want the statement polished. He wanted it to wound the place that had grown comfortable. By the morning of March 3rd, more than 4 million people had watched the full 16 minutes. Headlines spread in Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, English, French, German, Polish, and Tagalog. Many wrote about the tears, but the tears were not the story. The story was that the Pope had walked into a forgotten room, seen an old priest beside an uneaten tray, and forced the church to admit what its reports had hidden. At Casa Sant'Angelo, the consequences came quickly. A maintenance crew arrived. By mid-afternoon, the heating in the East Wing was working again. Extra nurses were assigned. The budget revision began. It did not fix everything, but for the first time in months, the building was no longer a clean document on a Vatican desk. It was a house full of elderly people who could no longer be unseen. On the morning of March 3rd, Elena brought a tablet to Sister Josephina in the common room. The old nun watched the entire statement without moving. When it ended, she kept her hands folded on the table and said, "He kept the important part." Elena asked what she meant. Sister Josephina looked up and said, "Father Lorenzo, he did not make it easier." When Father Lorenzo was told that the Pope had spoken about him to millions of people, he listened carefully. Then he said he had thought the visitor was the doctor, but the man had been kind, and a kind man was good company, doctor or not. Then he picked up his rosary. That evening, the heating worked. Dinner arrived hot. It was a small thing. It was everything. Because sometimes the church changes not when a document is signed, but when one forgotten person is finally seen. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with someone who believes the people who carried the church should never be left behind.